Good day, you guys. This is Mrs. Amy Elizabeth Manlapis from Linear High School, and today I'm presenting to you Key Concept 5.4 for AP World History Global Migration. Now, for students that are following along with me during the 2014-2015 school year, this is referring to days 15 and 16 for reading global migration and talking about on day 16, convict labor, seasonal migration, ethnic enclaves. It's all in the big migration packet that I've given you. If you are some stranger listening to this and you would like to go ahead and obtain the readings that I'm referring to, please see the notes down at the bottom of this video. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into it. Now, the main piece that you guys need to walk away from this lecture is knowing that migration in many cases is going to be influenced by overall changes in demography in both industrial and in non-industrialized societies. And these demographic changes in both industrial and non-industrialized nations are going to change the overall existing patterns of living. So most human beings have been living in ways that are relatively similar over the last few units of study since the beginning of the course. And this is where we see humanity as an animal, as humans in our fancy clothing outfits and whatnot. This is where humanity radically changes. And two of the most significant changes that we need to consider are going to be changes in food production as well as improved medical conditions, as they contribute to an overall rise in population because people can eat more regularly. They have sustainable, regular sources of food, a more diverse diet of, different foods and nutrients and minerals and all that stuff that we're supposed to eat and don't, as well as medicine that can treat people for like malaria, figuring out what cholera is, those sorts of medical treatments for various conditions that you guys have been reading about in Traditions and Encounters by our departed friend, Jerry Bentley. Now, the second part that you also need to consider is the influence of the Industrial Revolution, these new modes of transportation. And these new modes of transportation allow for the internal and external migration of people to cities, right? So people moving within a country internally, or moving away from a country to a city where there are going to be those new industrial jobs. And this pattern is going to continue throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th. But I'd like to go ahead now, and if you're taking notes, get excited. This is section A. We're talking about the various reasons why migrants relocate. And there are a number of reasons. I'm not going to be able to name all of them. I don't think Jerry Bentley could, but there are a couple of key examples that, again, I've listed for you guys in the comments. So make sure that you guys are checking the comment section for the reading assignments that this matches with, as well as, my notes and everything. They are not exhaustive. This is not exhaustive, but my voice is probably exhausting. That was terrible, and I'm going to shut up. Okay, so our first case study for talking about migrants relocating for various reasons are going to be manual laborers from Europe. Now, between 1800 and 1914, somewhere around 50 million European migrants leave their homes and they go somewhere else. Of those 50 million European migrants, they are about 32 million of those people will move to the United States. Now, the first wave of migrants are going to primarily come from Northern and Western Europe, primarily from Britain, Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. And this is during the early half of the 18th century, or not the 18th century, the 19th century, the 1800s, for those of you that are like, what is the 19th century? And if you don't know what the 19th century is, you should probably email me or leave a comment so I can help you. Anyway, so there's that first wave from Northern and Western Europe, early half of the 19th century. Now, the second wave during the late 19th century into the very early 20th century, people are primarily going to come from Southern and Eastern Europe. Polish folks from Poland, Russia, Jews fleeing from persecution from various places in Europe, as well as Slavic peoples from Eastern Europe and Russia, folks from Italy, Germany, or not Germany, that should be Greece, and as well as Portugal, people, the Portuguese. And again, all of these guys are going to be coming in this second wave of migration during the middle to late 19th century. And now most of these people in both waves of migration are going to be coming to the eastern half of the United States, and they are really going to be the main contributors to the early industrialization of the United States. Because without these migrants coming to the United States, there wouldn't have been any kind of industrial revolution in the US, because who's going to work in the factories? Who is going to dig the coal? Who is going to dig the iron? So all of these movements of migrants built the United States. It makes us the post-industrial power that we are today. And I think that's something important to keep in mind, especially in time period 6 when we delve into modern issues of migration. Now, most of these migrants are not skilled. They are coming from what we would probably characterize as peasant backgrounds, which sounds unkind, but they are unskilled laborers. They are not folks that have a particular set of skills like being carpenters or metal workers or much like that. But being an unskilled worker makes you incredibly attractive to industrialists who need minimum wage workers in order to operate machinery, lift heavy things, and to do it at a fairly low cost. The more specialized your labor is, as you guys should hopefully remember from earlier in this time period, the more money you can command, right? Because you're less, you're more skilled. There's going to be fewer people with your set of skills, right? So where do these people go? We've already talked about how a number of migrants to the tune of 32 million people moved to the United States. Now, what's interesting, however, is that they not only moved to the United States, they also moved to Canada, Argentina, New Zealand, and South Africa. And Canada, Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, we can characterize those places as being what are called settler colonies. And these settler colonies are migrants who move and stay in a place. And they eventually become free cultivators. And what free cultivators means, and some of these free cultivators or herders in these settler colonies of Australia, Argentina, anyway, you get the whole list from earlier, they also do sometimes perform acts of skilled labor in the mining industry or in some smaller industries. So that is something to kind of consider. The other point that you guys need to be thinking about is how the new global capitalist economy that's developed since 1750 is going to rely on coerced and semi-coerced labor migration. Now, the thing about it, whether or not we like to discuss it, is that slavery continues through this time period. Slavery continues up through the 1880s. I believe Brazil was the last place in, someone comment on that for me. I'm like 95% sure, but I'm 95% sure that it's Brazil that is the last to ban slavery. If that's incorrect, feel free to abuse me, because that's what the internet does, right? Okay. Anyway, but that's going to continue through the 1880s in some areas. Once slavery becomes a non-option, as it's outlawed, as it is, immoral and terrible, we see the development of Chinese and Indian indentured servitude. So what that means is that basically immigrants are going to be recruited from South Asia and East Asia, primarily China and India. And this is about 2.4 million folks that are leaving their homes and signing these contracts from anywhere to, 5 to 7 years. Between the years of 1820 and 1914. That's 2.5 million people. And these folks, they end up working in places like sugar plantations. And these sugar plantations include places like Malaya, South Africa, Fiji, the Guianas, Trinidad, and Jamaica. Many also kind of capitalized on a lot of China's internal problems during the period. So that in particular after the Opium Wars, which were so destructive and really kind of ruined China's economy in many ways, sent Chinese workers to Cuba and Hawaii. So sugar plantations in Cuba and Hawaii, guano mines in Peru. If you guys aren't reading your books, you're missing out on the fact that guano, aka bat poop, is a really important global commodity that you need to know about. Also gold mines in South Africa and Australia, as well as railroads in the United States and Canada. And some of your readings in that migration packet do address the issues of Chinese migration. In particular, you know, there's the Thomas Nast cartoon from Harper's Weekly. There's the picture illustrated by George Keller. There are also some pieces of testimony. So really make sure that you guys are reading these documents because they do illustrate these points. Now, when these workers become indentured servants, they sign restrictive agreements. And basically these are 5 to 7 year contracts that pay for the trip from their country to wherever they're going to work, where they're going to live, and their food. But a lot of these 5 to 7 year contracts get extended because people go into debt, like they need to borrow money because of an unexpected expense, or, you know, they get sick. So they're usually just paid just enough to keep it legal and not slavery, but also, you know, enough to make sure that they can't, like, save up and, you know, go to Harvard like Mr. Jones or something. I don't know why I said that. That was really weird. I apologize, listeners that don't know me. Now, again, you have to consider that these indentured servants are not slaves. They willingly sign these contracts and they are paid, but their payment, their labor conditions, everything about the lives of indentured servants is incredibly harsh. If they, you know, want to go buy stuff, it's incredibly expensive. The store where they're buying whatever they need is usually owned by their employers. So they're always going to be in a cycle of debt, repayment, more debt. And hopefully you guys kind of got that. If you don't, please remember to hit me up in the comments. We also need to consider a different form of unfree labor, and that is convict labor. That's convict labor. So for those of you that are fans of Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, this is for you, kids, right? You convicts in Australia. Now, the most famous of all convict labor systems belongs to England. That is what Charles Dickens wrote about in Great Expectations. And they have this program of transporting convicts that went all the way back to the 1700s, as we discussed during time period 4. And these convicts, I don't know why I keep saying convicts, I'm sorry, y'all, from England and Wales, they're sent to the United States to serve out their sentences in some remote location or the state of Georgia, and also to make sure that they get their criminal element away from proper British society. This policy of sending convicts to places like Georgia it didn't work. So they ended it in 1776 because of what? I can't hear you. What happened in 1776? Oh, that's right, the Revolution. And while all of that business was going on, the English also tried to send convicts to West Africa. This didn't work as well. So they ended up using the new British territory of Australia, and it's seen as the ideal place to kind of store these, you know, problematic convicts, because it allows these criminals to be removed from Britain, but it also makes it super hard for them to get back to Britain and when their sentence is over, because it's really expensive to travel from Australia to Great Britain, and there's no like transport back home or anything. So chances are, if you're sent to Australia to work, you will stay in Australia for the rest of your life. But the biggest debate with the British sending convicts to Australia is going to be whether or not Parliament sees Australia as like just a giant jail, or if there is an actual plan to, you know, colonize Australia with people that are unwilling, but to actually like legitimately colonize Australia. The first group of Australian convict laborers left in May 1787. They arrived in January 1788 in what is now called New South Wales. And for 75 years, the British would continue to send convicts to New South Wales and other destinations in Australia. And these are the founders of Australia's population. And don't judge Australia by that. Judge Australia by all of the snakes that can kill you. And you also have to consider as well, guys, the issue of gold in Australia. By the time that gold is discovered in Australia in 1851, it's so weird that policy of, sending conflicts, man, this is awful, to Australia disappears. So it's kind of funny. They discover gold. Don't want to use that anymore. I don't know how strong that correlation is, but it is kind of an interesting footnote. And also don't forget what happens to the Aborigines, the natives of Australia. They are obviously, like all other native populations, going to be wiped out by disease brought by the convicts from Britain, as well as people just going out and killing them and taking their land. And BTW, Aborigines do still live in Australia. It's still a modern issue, just like Native Americans here in the United States. So I hope you guys enjoyed that talk about the different forms of free and unfree migratory labor. I'd like to go ahead now and have you guys turn to the portion of your readings that deals with Italian migration to Argentina. Italian migration to Argentina is an example of migrants who are relocating for temporary and seasonal purposes, right? Because different opposite seasons, allowing the migrants in Italy to work in Italy during the planting and harvest season in Italy, then traveling to Argentina to work during, the planting and harvest season in Argentina, and always having a steady source of income. And again, this is referring to a reading in your migration packet that you guys have, those readings. Please make sure that you're reading them. If you are not in my class, again, check the comments. So the first time that we see Italians in a significantly large group moving to Argentina, that really happened in the 1880s, which it is the beginning of a great boom of foreign investment in Argentina. What ends up happening is Argentinian ranchers begin to take advantage of the fact that Europe has grown to almost unsustainable numbers. Europe can no longer feed itself, so there are issues with famines, unemployment, poverty, and they begin to add food crops to their livestock on their ranches because they're now able to sell food, and Argentina is incredibly great for that. So these ranchers expand beyond cattle and, horses and whatnot and start growing food. And as there begins to be an even greater demand for that food, laborers from Italy begin to be recruited to Argentina, and they migrate with the seasons. And not sure if you guys are aware of this, but Italy is really far from Argentina, and leaving Italy for Argentina to work the growing seasons, that is in history the longest distance for seasonal migrant workers in world history. It's completely crazy. So they would harvest their crops in Italy during the summer, and then they would come when Italy was in the summer or in the winter. They would come to Argentina in the spring and summer to work their cattle and to work horses and other crops to be able to, again, work year round. Some people eventually do decide that, hey, moving from Italy to Argentina and back from Argentina to Italy is not sustainable. Most of the migrants that are leaving are primarily what gender? Oh, you said men. That's fantastic that you said men, because that is correct. And so a lot of men chose to stay and bring their families to Argentina, or sometimes Italian men would meet Argentinian women and marry and settle down. And when you guys are reading your article about Italians living in Argentina, I really want you to consider the reasons that these migrants have for leaving Argentina or leaving Italy and going to Argentina, and the changes that this is going to create between the genders in Italy, between men and women, how this changes family dynamics. And consider their reception in Argentina. Are they, are the Argentinians excited to see their Italian migrant workers coming and actually settling down and staying and, building homes and having families? Is this positive or is this not? And I'd also like for you guys to think about issues of national identity and nationalism as well. What does this mean for, let's say, a child whose father is Italian and his mother is Argentinian? How does that kid grow up? What is their national identity? Consider all of those issues from time period 5.3 that we discussed earlier with nationalism. What does that kid's national identity look like? What language do they speak? And those are going to be all important questions. These questions too of identity and culture and language are also brought up in the second half of your Italy reading, your Italy and Argentina reading, when we also consider Japanese migrants moving from Japan to Brazil, and how the children that are born in Brazil, in not just mixed marriages, but in marriages between, people that are Japanese but were born in Brazil, what their lives and experiences are like. Okay? So, I hope that helps. And again, if this is confusing, hit me up in the comments. I hope you guys are ready for our third and final section of this hopefully fascinating and educational lecture on global migration from 1750 to 1900, because now we're in Part C, and Part C is discussing how basically migration, because it is so large scale, it is now a global effort in the 19th century. People are crossing oceans. So it's going to produce a really crazy number of various consequences and reactions to societies becoming more diverse, because migrants are coming from places all over the world and they're going to be joining these existing populations. So call this section whatever you want. You maybe migrants and existing populations. I don't know. But anyway, this is the third part of this. Now, one thing that you guys should consider, and I brought up earlier when discussing the Argentinian Italian issue, is that because most of the labor that is being done by migrants, or that is in demand, most migrants are going to tend to be male, because the jobs that these migrants are taking, as you all have learned in your reading, are not like, I'm here to be a neuroscientist or a journalist. Most migrants are coming to work in sugarcane plantations, pick cotton, work in factories for very low wages. So these are jobs that could not be filled from the pre-existing population of, that they're joining. Sorry, I had the language fail. Now, this means that these migrant populations are going to be primarily men. And if for whatever reason these men are continuing, if they're not permanently relocating, then they're going to be moving seasonally back and forth. And as I said, this is going to change gender and family dynamics, because in a single parent household, you can no longer have those issues of, well, that's, daddy work or mommy work. There is no more gendering of labor when, when a spouse is off working thousands of miles away in another nation. And when they come home, there are now these new complexities of, what do I do now that my spouse is back for 6 months of the year, and what do I do without them during those 6 months of the year? And a lot of these roles in the home societies that used to belong to men now belong to women. Or if women aren't allowed to have these roles, women begin to demand recognition and the ability to take on these roles. Now, once a population of migrants does come to a place, what is interesting is that migrants end up creating what are called ethnic enclaves. And ethnic enclaves is just an academic way of saying you live near people that are like you. So these are like your, little Koreas or Chinatowns or little Jamaica, right? Hell's Kitchen in New York. These are all neighborhoods of folks that all have a similar background to each other, right? Because if you're of Korean ancestry and you want Korean food, you want to be able to speak your own language and have people that know you and where you're from and at home, and to give those things to your children, it's great to live in a neighborhood where your neighbors are similar to you. Yeah? Make sense? And that's great, because especially as a new person to a new country, you have people there, you have a pre-existing support system. One of my favorite examples of this, while I did reference China and Korea, as that's something we'd be familiar with here in Gwinnett County, you also should consider people moving from India, Indians moving to places like Trinidad, where they form their own communities and they continue to speak their various South Asian languages. They prepare foods. And then what's really exciting, if you feel like, eating some sweet food from Trinidad, their own culture that they have brought to Trinidad as a migrant, Indian culture, begins to diffuse throughout Trinidad. So that is one really interesting thing, is looking at the impact of migration on food. So if you like to eat, I recommend that. Now, unfortunately, a lot of receiving societies do not embrace immigrants, and this is seen in the various degrees of documents and in various degrees of rejection in the documents that I have given you about the Chinese Exclusion Acts here in the United States. And basically, the Chinese Exclusion Acts are the case study that I chose, which illustrates how a growing number of migrants from some place that is culturally and socially different from the place that they're going to be rejected or be thought of with some level of suspicion. And this case study with the United States and in China, very specifically, the United States saw how many people were coming from China to the U.S. and in 1882 halted all migration from China. And the reason why the United States gets so anti-immigrant in the 1880s isn't because everyone, had a meeting and they're like, psst, we're all here to become anti-migrant and we're going to hate all these people. That's not it. But what happens is the United States in the 1880s is experiencing record numbers of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. And what ends up happening is a lot of these folks are coming from places where they are very poor, they're very sick, and because of ideas about Darwinism, inheritance, and race, and money, they begin to develop these ideas that the United States could possibly be ruined by people of poor racial stock, and that don't understand how democracy works, and it's crazy. But what's interesting is that despite all of these fears because of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, it's only China where immigrants are barred from coming to the United States. There was this sort of popular idea among the American public that the Chinese brought down wages and stole jobs from qualified American workers. As you all read through the documents, you'll see that according to, historical sources, this is not the case. But because the Chinese are so culturally and linguistically different from the majority of Americans who come from, Western European descent, it creates a lot of cultural tension between the two peoples. And the result is going to be the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And basically the Chinese Exclusion Acts ban the immigration of all Chinese workers for 20 years. And it requires that all resident Chinese, anyone of Chinese descent who is an American resident or an American citizen, has to carry paperwork. And if you want to be a citizen and you're Chinese, too bad. You cannot be a citizen. And what I'd like for you to do when looking through these documents that consider the American response to, the Chinese Exclusion Acts. So these are some of the questions that I'd like for you to consider. Number one, I'd like for you to consider how the documents are recording the economic activities of the Chinese immigrants. What sort of things are they buying? What sorts of jobs are they working? What is the relationship between, your average Chinese immigrant that is, being documented in this set of documents, and what exactly are they doing? The second part is, among the United States, who really wins the most when looking at Chinese labor? If, are there actually people losing jobs? What do the sources have to say about that? I'd also like for you to consider the qualities that the opponents of Chinese immigration seem to fear the most, and what those qualities sort of say about the anxieties of Americans in the United States during the late 19th century. And both sides, which is a really fascinating perspective on this whole migration debate, is that both the defenders of Chinese immigration and those that oppose Chinese immigration, they both appeal to what we call American values. I'm making air quotes, but American values. And I'd like for you guys to consider what are these American values that both sides that are either for or against Chinese immigration are appealing to. What is Americanness in the context of migration? And finally, I'd like for you to consider what would actually help support the arguments of someone who is either in favor or opposed to Chinese immigration, looking at these documents. And if you listen to this recording anytime before the 25th at 12 p.m. on February 25th, 2015, and you come see me and use the password, I don't know. I'm tired. I'm not doing that. I'll see you later. Bye. This was the worst.